On a humid summer day in 2007, the small, quiet town of Mapleton, Alabama became the backdrop for a secret affair that would lead to tragedy. John Miller, a 45-year-old construction foreman, was known around town as a hard worker and a dedicated father. 2 years prior, his wife Anna Miller had died after a long battle with cancer. Her death had left John devastated, but he poured all his energy into raising their only child, Iris. Iris, now 20 years old, was in the final stretch of high school. Preparing for graduation, she had grown up in the shadow of her mother's illness and had learned to be independent with John, working long hours to support them. Iris spent most of her time alone or with friends. She was a bright, intelligent young woman, but had become increasingly rebellious. Since her mother's death, she felt trapped in the small town, longing for freedom, adventure, and a life that felt bigger than Mapleton. Her relationship with her father was strained. John, protective and often strict, feared losing her, just as he had lost his wife, but his protectiveness only pushed Iris further away. Next door to the Miller family lived Officer Mark Williams, a 35-year-old policeman who had become a shadow of his former self. Once, a respected officer, Mark's life began to unravel. After his wife Linda left him, the divorce, Force had been ugly, with accusations of abuse and violence, unable to cope with the separation. Mark spiraled into alcoholism. His once proud career had taken a sharp decline, and his personal life was in shambles. Most days, Mark was drunk, wandering around town or sitting on his front porch, staring blankly into space. Despite his deteriorating mental state, Mark still held on to a semblance of authority. His uniform and badge provided him with a sense of power and control, something he desperately craved. It was during this period of loneliness and self-destruction that he became infatuated with Iris. She reminded him of the younger, hopeful version of his ex-wife, full of life, curiosity, and energy. To Mark, she represented the excitement and passion he had lost. John had always been wary of Mark, noticing the way he would linger outside the house and make casual, unnecessary conversations with Iris. Whenever John wasn't around, Mark's eyes would linger on Iris longer than John liked, but without any concrete evidence of inappropriate behavior, John hesitated to act. Still, he was protective, warning Iris to stay away from the troubled officer. But Iris, feeling suffocated by her father's overprotection and seeking something thrilling to break the monotony of her life, found herself intrigued by Mark's attention. She was flattered by the way he looked at her, talked to her, and treated her as an adult, not just John Miller's daughter. Despite the warnings, Iris began sneaking out of the house to meet Mark in secret. The attention from an older man, especially one in a position of authority, was exciting for her. It felt like rebellion, something she could control, unlike the other aspects of her life. Mark, on the other hand, viewed their affair as something more than just a fling in his alcohol-fueled mind. He believed that Iris was drawn to him because she saw him as her protector, someone who understood her in a way her father never could. His obsession with her grew. He began to shower her with attention, compliments, and affection, becoming increasingly possessive. He would wait for her outside her house, text her late at night, and demand to know where she was when they weren't together. He was intoxicated by the idea that he could control her, just as he had tried to control his ex-wife. John's suspicions grew. As Iris became more distant, she began spending more time out of the house, claiming to be studying with friends or working late on school projects, but John knew his daughter, and her behavior didn't sit right with him. He noticed the changes in her, the sudden defensiveness, the evasive answers to his questions, and the way she would avoid eye contact when he brought up Mark's name. It wasn't long before J.N. decided to confront Mark. One evening, he caught the officer loitering near the house and told him directly to stay away from Iris. The confrontation was tense. J.N. made it clear that he would report any inappropriate behavior to Mark's superiors, but Mark, drunk and full of arrogance, pushed back. He told John that he had more power than he realized and could ruin John's life if he wanted to. The thinly veiled threat rattled John, but he didn't back down. Iris, caught between her father's suspicions and Mark's growing obsession, felt trapped. She wasn't in love with Mark, but the affair had gone too far. and she didn't know how to end it without angering him. She lied to her father, promising him that she would stop seeing Mark, but in reality, she continued the relationship in secret. Sneaking out late at night while her father slept, as the summer of 2007 progressed, John Miller's growing unease turned into full-blown suspicion. He began noticing patterns. Officer Mark Williams's patrol car seemed to appear in the neighborhood far more often than necessary, often late at night or during odd hours, when he was certain Mark had no official business nearby. John's concern for his daughter, Iris, intensified. Something was clearly wrong. Though Iris continued to evade his questions, offering half-hearted excuses about studying late with friends or spending time out of the house, Mark's behavior toward Iris had grown increasingly bold, no longer content to simply steal glances or make idle conversation. He started lurking near the Miller household, trying to find opportunities to meet Iris privately. J.N. began to notice Mark's subtle advances more frequently, small gestures that when viewed in isolation might seem harmless, but together painted a clear picture of inappropriate behavior. Mark's presence was no longer just a nuisance. It had become an overt intrusion into their lives. One evening, J.N. decided he couldn't wait any longer. He saw Mark parked near the house again, and this time J.N. walked straight over to the officer's car. His anger simmered beneath the surface, but he tried to remain calm when Mark rolled down his window. John leaned in and warned him firmly, telling him to stay away from Iris. John made it clear that he would not hesitate to report Mark's behavior to his superiors at the police department. If it didn't stop, Mark didn't take the warning. Well, his eyes were cold, and the threat in his voice was unmistakable. He laughed off John's words with a sneer, dismissing him with a casual wave of his hand. Then, with a sudden shift in tone, Mark leaned closer and responded with chilling arrogance. He warned John that he had connections, he knew how to bend the rules, and if John dared to report anything, Mark could easily ruin him. He spoke with the confidence of someone who had the power to manipulate the system, someone who believed he was untouchable. The subtle threat lingered in the air as Mark drove off, leaving John both enraged and deeply unsettled. John returned to his house, feeling powerless. His attempts to protect Iris seemed to backfire. The once clear line between his role as her protector and the chaos Mark brought into their lives had blurred. He had raised his daughter to trust and respect authority figures. But now that trust was being weaponized against them, Mark wasn't just another man interested in his daughter. He was a police officer, someone who wielded real influence in their small town. The sense of helplessness weighed heavily on John's shoulders, and his frustration grew with each passing day. That night, John confronted Iris directly. He asked her to sit down in the living room, where the tension between them was palpable. He told her about his encounter with Mark and how he had warned him to stay away. Iris was visibly uncomfortable, shifting nervously in her seat as John spoke. But when he pleaded with her to stop seeing Mark, her response was deflective. She assured her father that it wasn't serious, and that Mark was just being friendly, but John wasn't convinced. His tone softened as he begged her to see the danger in the situation, to understand that Mark was manipulating her. Iris, however, seemed conflicted. She had been caught between her father's growing concern and Mark's increasing possessiveness, and now she felt trapped. Despite the attention, Iris promised John that she would stop seeing Mark. She knew her father meant well, but the excitement and attention she received from Mark had become intoxicating. It was a dangerous game, but one she didn't fully understand to John. Her promise brought a brief sense of relief. He wanted to believe her, needed to believe that she would finally end the relationship. He couldn't bear the thought of losing her, especially not after the loss of his wife. However, the truth was far more complicated. Iris had no intention of stopping. She was both afraid of Mark's reaction and entranced by the thrill of the secret. Though Mark's possessiveness had become more apparent, she rationalized his behavior as a sign of affection, proof that he cared for her more than anyone else. What she didn't see was how his need for control was slowly taking over the relationship he had started, monitoring her whereabouts, texting her obsessively and showing up unannounced. But instead of feeling alarmed, Iris mistook his behavior for love. Meanwhile, Mark became bolder in his actions. The warnings from John only fueled his sense of power, making him believe he had more control over the situation than he actually did. He knew how to manipulate people, how to exploit his position as a police officer. To him, JN was just an obstacle, a man who could be easily outmaneuvered. Mark's obsession with Iris deepened, and his grip on her life tightened. As the days passed, the tension within the Miller household grew unbearable. John watched his daughter closely, hoping to see a change in her behavior, but instead she became even more distant. The brief moments of calm were overshadowed by his nagging suspicion that something wasn't right. His gut told him that Iris was still seeing Mark, and though he tried to ignore it, the fear gnawed at him. In late August 2007, John Miller, a 45-year-old widower, left for a work trip that required him to be out of town for several days. His daughter Iris assured him she would stay with a friend while he was gone, easing his concerns. In reality, Iris had made secret plans to meet Officer Mark Williams at their home. She had been continuing her relationship with Mark. Despite Jay's earlier warnings, that evening Mark arrived at the Miller residence, and the two secluded themselves in Iris's bedroom, where the lines between affection and control blurred further. Meanwhile, JN, only a few hours into his trip, realized he had forgotten crucial work documents. He made the decision to turn back, unaware of what awaited him when he arrived at the house. His pulse quickened as he spotted a patrol car parked in far front of his home, a sight that filled him with an immediate sense of dread. He recognized the car as Mark's, unable to shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. John rushed inside. His footsteps were quick and heavy as he climbed the stairs toward Iris's bedroom. When he burst through the door, the scene that met him confirmed his worst fears. Mark and Iris, partially undressed, were in bed together. The shock and betrayal hit John with full force, and without hesitation, he lunged at Mark in a fury. A brutal fistfight ensued in the small bedroom. The confined space only amplified the intensity of the brawl. John, consumed by rage, landed several blows, but Mark, younger and trained in physical confrontation, fought back just as fiercely as the struggle escalated. Mark's hand found his service weapon. In the chaos and panic of the moment, Mark discharged his firearm, striking John multiple times. The gunshots echoed through the house, piercing the once quiet night. Iris, standing frozen in the corner, screamed as she watched her father collapse. The reality of what had just occurred crashed down on her with devastating clarity. John lay motionless on the floor, his blood spreading across the carpet. Mark, panting and wide-eyed, stood over John's lifeless body, his mind racing as he processed the enormity of his actions. Mark knew instantly that he had crossed a line from which there was no return. Killing John, a respected man in the community inside his own home, would not only end his career, but likely send him to prison. In a state of desperate calculation, he turned to Iris, urging her to cooperate with a fabricated story. His voice, steady but urgent, laid out a new narrative. He told Iris that they had to tell the police her father had been molesting her, and that she had finally screamed for help. Mark, supposedly just returning from work, heard her cries and rushed into the house to intervene. According to this version, when John saw Mark enter, he became violent and attacked him. Mark then claimed he had no choice but to shoot John in self-defense. As Mark spoke, he pressed Iris to agree, convincing her that this was the only way they could avoid ruin. Iris, overwhelmed by shock, confusion, and the weight of the moment, hesitated her loyalty to her father, Ward, with the emotional hold Mark had on her. But Mark's manipulation, combined with her own fear and guilt, led her to reluctantly agree. Numb and trembling, she nodded, her voice barely audible, as she complied with Mark's twisted plan. Mark Williams wasted no time after the shooting. His training as a police officer kicked in immediately, and he grabbed his radio, calling into his department His voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of tension as he reported that he had overheard screams coming from the Miller house and had been forced to intervene when John Miller was attacking his daughter. Iris, according to Mark John, had been violent, and when Mark tried to stop him, John fought back, leaving Mark with no choice but to shoot in self-defense. The call set off an immediate response within minutes. Flashing lights from squad cars and ambulances illuminated the quiet Mapleton Street. Officers and paramedics arrived at the scene, finding John Miller dead on the floor of his home, blood pooling beneath his lifeless body. Iris, pale and visibly shaken, stood nearby, her face a mix of shock and fear. Mark, standing by with his hands steady, appeared outwardly composed, but the tension in his expression was clear. When questioned by the responding officers, Mark recounted his version of events. He claimed he had just returned from his shift when he heard frantic screams coming from the Miller house. Alarmed, he rushed over to investigate and found John in a violent rage, attacking Iris. Mark explained that he had no choice but to step in and defend her, ultimately leading to the fatal shooting. As protocol dictated, Mark was placed on administrative leave. While the investigation got underway, it was standard procedure for any officer involved in a shooting, but there was an unspoken assumption among many of the responding officers that Mark had done what he needed to do. After all, John Miller had a reputation for being strict and overprotective of his daughter paramedics, declared John dead at the scene, and moved his body to the morgue for a formal autopsy. Meanwhile, investigators began their work. They secured the crime scene, took photographs, collected forensic evidence, and started gathering statements from those involved. Mark gave his version of events, calmly describing how he'd rushed over after hearing Iris scream and had found John in a violent rage. He said he tried to reason with John, but the man had been out of control. Mark claimed he had no choice but to defend himself when John turned his aggression toward him. Iris's interview followed not long after at the police station. She echoed Mark's story, her voice trembling as she described how her father had suddenly attacked her, enraged and out of control. She recounted how Mark had come to her rescue only to be forced into shooting her father when things escalated. Her story was convincing enough, especially given the circumstances: her father dead and her rescuer now facing scrutiny. To the officers listening, she seemed like a traumatized young woman caught in the middle of a tragic situation beyond her control. However, Detective Lisa Franklin, the lead investigator on the case, wasn't entirely convinced. Franklin had been in law enforcement for over 2 decades, and her instincts told her something was wrong. From the moment she observed Iris's behavior, she knew something was off. While Iris's words mirrored Mark's account, her body language told a different story. She avoided eye contact, and her hands trembled so violently that it seemed like she was on the verge of a breakdown. To Franklin, Iris didn't just seem traumatized, she seemed scared. And not just scared of the situation, but scared of something or someone specific. Franklin's suspicions deepened as she delved into the details of the case. One glaring issue was the timing. Neighbors were interviewed, and none had heard any shouting or screams that would suggest a violent altercation before the shooting. Then there was the physical evidence. The scene at the Miller home appeared strangely orderly, almost too neat, as though carefully staged to fit the narrative Mark and Iris provided. There were no overturned furniture or signs of a struggle one might expect in such a tense situation. Additionally, certain forensic findings, like the angle of the gunshots and the positioning of John's body, raised questions that didn't align with Mark's version of events. Determined to dig deeper, Franklin ordered a full forensic analysis of the scene, including ballistic tests on the bullet casings found near John's body. She also began looking more closely into Mark Williams' background. She knew that he had been through a rough patch, having recently gone through a messy divorce, and there were whispers among the department about his temper and occasional misconduct. His close relationship with Iris, too, raised red flags in Franklin's mind as she continued her investigation. Franklin made a point of speaking with John's friends, colleagues, and neighbors, trying to build a clearer picture of his character. The more she dug, the more she found evidence to suggest that John had been a caring, albeit strict father, not the kind of man to suddenly turn violent without provocation. Franklin's suspicions about Mark grew stronger as the inconsistencies mounted. Something about the way the story was being spun seemed too convenient to rehearse. Franklin wasn't ready to close the case, not by a long shot. While the initial investigation painted a picture of a tragic domestic dispute gone wrong, she believed there was far more to the story. Mark's version of events, once seemingly airtight, now appeared riddled with holes. And Iris, the young woman at the center of it all, seemed to be holding back the truth. Whether out of fear, loyalty, or manipulation, Franklin knew it was only a matter of time before the cracks in their story started to show. 2 weeks after the incident, the Mapleton Police Department received a surprising call from Henry Matthews, a longtime resident of the quiet neighborhood. Matthews had kept mostly to himself over the years, but had grown increasingly concerned about something he had observed in the weeks leading up to John Miller's death. He told Detective Lisa Franklin that he had noticed Officer Mark Williams visiting the Miller home multiple times while John was away at work. These visits seemed odd to Henry, especially because they always occurred when only Iris was home. Henry had seen the pair exchanging hushed words and noticed their strange body language, which led him to believe there was more going on than met the eye. Though hesitant at first, Henry now realized the importance of sharing this information. Franklin's ears perked up at the new lead. The claim added a layer of complexity to the case that she hadn't anticipated. Up until this point, the investigation had centered around the version of events provided by Mark and Iris. The statement from Henry Matthews cast doubt on their narrative, implying there might have been an inappropriate and possibly predatory relationship between Mark and Iris long before the night of the shooting. The possibility of an affair, particularly with a minor, was explosive in a town like Mapleton, where the reputation of the police department mattered. Deeply armed with this new information, Franklin began pulling at the threads of Mark Williams's past. She dug into his service record, looking for anything that could shed light on his character. What she found was disturbing. While his official record as an officer was mostly clean, there were whispers of misconduct that had been quietly swept under the rug. A closer look into his personal life revealed the messy details of his failed marriage. Mark's ex-wife had accused him of being controlling and abusive, and she had filed multiple domestic violence complaints before ultimately leaving him. However, those complaints had never gone far. Mark's position as a police officer likely played a role in suppressing the severity of the accusations. Franklin also discovered that Mark had been reprimanded internally for his behavior toward women in the past, but the details had been hidden from public scrutiny. At the same time, Franklin looked deeper into John Miller's background, hoping to find something that might corroborate the violent image painted by Mark's story. What she found was the opposite. J.N. had been well regarded in Mapleton, a hard-working man who had raised his daughter alone after losing his wife Rachel to cancer. 2 years prior, J.N. had no history of violence, no criminal record, and was described by friends and co-workers as a devoted father who was strict but fair with Iris. The contrast between John's reputation and Mark was stark, raising more questions about what had truly transpired that night. Henry's testimony and Franklin's discoveries about Mark's past created a troubling new theory. The affair between Mark and Iris appeared less consensual and more like an abuse of power. Franklin began to suspect that Iris, drawn into a manipulative relationship with Mark, may have been under his control in more ways than one. The timing of John's death, the inconsistencies in the physical evidence, and now this revelation about Mark's predatory behavior made Franklin increasingly certain that the story being told by Mark and Iris was fabricated. As Franklin continued to peel back the layers of the case, she realized that Mark Williams' position as a police officer had shielded him from scrutiny for years. The quiet town of Mapleton, which had trusted its officers implicitly, was now facing the possibility that one of its own had not only abused his authority, but may have orchestrated a cover-up of murder. Detective Lisa Franklin, determined to get to the bottom of the case, began by meticulously retracing Officer Mark Williams' movements on the day of John Miller's murder. According to initial reports, Mark had claimed he was returning home from his police shift when he heard screams emanating from John's house. This timeline was crucial because it supported his version of events, in which he intervened only after hearing distress calls. However, Franklin's investigation unearthed a significant discrepancy. Mark had not been on duty that day. He had been off since noon, which meant that his account of the timing was inaccurate. Franklin interviewed multiple neighbors to piece together the timeline of events. Their testimonies were consistent and pointed to a troubling fact: no one had heard screams or any significant commotion coming from the Miller residence until after the gunshots were fired. This contradicted Mark's story and cast doubt on his account. Moreover, another neighbor reported seeing Mark's patrol car parked outside John's house well before the time of the shooting. This detail was particularly damning because it suggested that Mark had been present at the scene of the crime long before he claimed to have arrived with these revelations in mind. Franklin turned to forensic experts to re-examine the crime scene. They made a critical discovery. A pair of blue socks, clearly marked as police issued, was found under Iris's bed. The presence of these socks suggested that Mark had been inside the Miller home for an extended period before the confrontation occurred. This evidence implied that Mark had been waiting in the house, contradicting his claim of a sudden and spontaneous intervention. Further investigation led Franklin to Iris's phone, where she uncovered incriminating text messages exchanged between Iris and Mark. These messages explicitly confirmed their romantic relationship and indicated that their interactions had been ongoing. The nature of these texts provided additional context to the affair and suggested a deeper level of deception between the two. Armed with this mounting evidence, Franklin decided it was time to confront Iris directly. In a tense interrogation, she laid out the inconsistencies in Iris's story, presenting the evidence that showed Mark had been in the house for hours before the shooting, and that their romantic real relationship was well documented. Faced with the overwhelming evidence, Iris began to crumble under the pressure. She admitted to Franklin that her father's return home was unplanned and unexpected. When Johan had arrived and discovered her with Mark, a violent confrontation ensued. In a panic, Mark had shot John, but the narrative that Mark had initially presented to the police was a fabricated lie intended to cover up the premeditated nature of the crime. Iris's confession was a turning point in the investigation, revealing the full extent of the deceit and the premeditated nature of the murder. It became clear that Mark had orchestrated the situation to frame John as an aggressor, using his authority and Iris's vulnerability to cover his tracks. Franklin's diligent work in unraveling the lies was now poised to bring the truth to light and hold those responsible accountable for the crime. In the wake of Iris's confession and the mounting evidence, Detective Lisa Franklin prepared for a decisive confrontation with Officer Mark Williams. The focus of this meeting was to challenge Mark with the accumulated proof of his guilt. Franklin arranged a follow-up interrogation, ensuring that Mark entered the room unarmed and under intense scrutiny. The initial phase of the interrogation was designed to be disarming. Franklin engaged Mark in seemingly casual conversation, giving him the illusion of control. However, this approach quickly shifted as Franklin methodically laid out the evidence against him. She presented the detailed timeline discrepancies, including the fact that Mark had been off duty and present at the Miller residence well before the shooting. The neighbor's testimony corroborated the fact that Mark's car had been seen at the scene prior to the incident. Franklin also detailed the forensic findings, such as the police-issued socks found under Iris's bed, which indicated Mark's extended presence in the home. As Franklin presented these facts, Mark's demeanor began to change. He initially remained defensive, attempting to deflect and downplay the evidence. However, when Franklin Forley accused him of murder, Mark's confidence wavered. He claimed that Iris was fabricating the story in an attempt to save herself from the consequences of their illicit relationship. He insisted that he was merely a bystander and that Iris had concocted a false narrative to shift the blame. Despite his protests, the weight of the evidence was overwhelming. The inconsistency between Mark's account and the corroborating testimonies left him cornered. His attempts to shift blame and deny responsibility only highlighted the depth of his deception. Following Mark Williams' arrest, the legal proceedings moved swiftly. The courtroom was filled with tension as the case against the former police officer fed the trial, drew significant attention from the local community and media, all keen to witness the resolution of this high-profile case that had shaken Mapleton, Alabama. In the opening statements, the prosecution, led by District Attorney Claire Thompson, laid out the case against Mark Williams. She detailed the timeline of events, starting with the illicit affair between Mark and Iris Miller, and ending with the fatal confrontation on the night of John Miller's murder. Tom emphasized the premeditated nature of the crime, arguing that Mark had used his position of trust and authority to manipulate and ultimately murder John Miller. The prosecution presented a clear narrative. Mark, driven by his own desires and a sense of entitlement, had crossed a line from which there was no return. The defense, represented by Mark's attorney, Stephen Grant, aimed to cast doubt on the prosecution's version of events. Grant argued that Mark had acted in self-defense, asserting that Iris's father had attacked him upon discovering the affair. The defense claimed that the shooting was a tragic outcome of a tense and chaotic situation. Rather than a premeditated act of violence, the prosecution called several key witnesses to the stand. Iris Miller, who had initially supported Mark's fabricated story, now faced a grueling cross-examination. She detailed the nature of her relationship with Mark and the events leading up to the confrontation with her father. Her testimony was emotionally charged, reflecting the deep personal conflict she had experienced under the weight of detailed questioning. Iris confirmed the affair and described the moment when her father unexpectedly returned home, leading to the violent altercation. Neighbors and forensic experts were also called to testify. Neighbors provided accounts of the absence of any pre-shooting disturbances, which contradicted Mark's claim of an escalating conflict. Forensic experts presented evidence showing the presence of police-issued socks under Iris's bed, supporting the claim that Mark had been in the house for an extended period. Before the shooting, Mark Williams took the stand in his defense, maintaining his position that he had acted in self-defense. He recounted his version of the events, claiming that he had heard screams. Upon returning from his shift and rushed to assist Iris. According to Mark, he was forced to shoot John in order to protect Iris. When John attacked him, his testimony was marked by emotional appeals and attempts to justify his actions, but the inconsistencies in his story were highlighted by the prosecution. In closing arguments, District Attorney Claire Thompson summarized the evidence, emphasizing the premeditated nature of Mark's actions and the manipulation of Iris. She argued that Mark's position as a police officer had allowed him to abuse his power and evade immediate scrutiny. Thompson urged the jury to consider the gravity of the crime and the impact it had on the Miller family and the community. Stephen Grant, the defense attorney, reiterated the claim of self-defense, presenting Mark as a man caught in an unfortunate and dangerous situation. Grant suggested that the prosecution had failed to provide a clear motive for Mark's alleged premeditation and urged the jury to consider the possibility of chaotic confrontation rather than a planned act of murder. The jury, composed of 12 local residents, deliberated extensively over the evidence and testimonies they discussed. The credibility of witnesses, the forensic evidence, and the inconsistencies in Mark's account. After several hours of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict of guilty for second-degree murder. The verdict was met with a mixture of relief and somber reflection. Mark Williams was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole, reflecting the severity of his crime and the breach of trust he had committed. The sentencing was attended by John Miller's family, who expressed a profound sense of closure despite the immense personal loss. Thank you for being with me so far in the video. If you like it, and subscribe to our channel to see more videos. Thank you all.